Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiana Manpour in London. In his first trip abroad as president-elect, Donald Trump is in France this weekend to celebrate the opening of the Notre Dame Cathedral 5 years after parts of it were burnt down in a freak accident. Dispensing with protocol, world leaders like Emmanuel Macron are eager to meet with him and take the measure of the man they know as a deliberate disruptor on the world stage as well as at home. His second term could mark a seismic shift, with populist nationalism on the rise and a rejection of the status quo. One leader who knows him very well is the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And here's a little bit of advice for those who would negotiate with Trump.
I think President Trump lives off actually acting unconventionally. And I think he smells when people are a little bit afraid of him. And when you're not, then you can enter into good talks with him.
So she clocked Trump's bullying style and came up trumps. And in our conversation, Merkel dishes freely on being tested by strongmen like him and Putin. I caught up with her in Washington, D.C. this week on the U.S. leg of her Freedom book tour. Chancellor Merkel, welcome to the program.
Ja, guten Tag.
We're in the United States. There's a new president of the United States who will take office in January, Donald Trump. You were one of the first world leaders to meet him. You came to Washington. And out of sight of the cameras, you shook hands, you did your thing, etc. In sight of the cameras in the famous Oval Office with the fireplace between you, he didn't want to shake hands with you. And even though you asked him kind of discreetly, he just refused point blank and kept looking at the cameras. And I thought it was really interesting because you said he wanted to create conversation fodder through his behavior, while I thought I was having a discussion with somebody completely normal. Is he not completely normal in your view?
I think President Trump lives off actually acting unconventionally, and in this way draws the attention of people to himself. Either he shook the hands of some of my colleagues 3 times longer than you usually do, or with me, he didn't do it at all. At this point in time, I had forgotten, and normally you would say, well, you shake hands and that's it. But when you're in this situation, you don't even think about it. But with him, all of these external things, these gestures, all were part of a statement, because he wanted to very clearly show that outside of political talks, in these situations, he puts down a marker, whatever he means with it.
You also described him as I dealt in facts, he dealt with emotions. How did that affect some of the key issues that you were trying to deal with, his emotional view of politics?
Ich würde sagen, im Rückblick, I would say, looking back, we, and I'm also speaking here of NATO members and EU members, we were actually able to get to sensible agreements with him. But when you think about tariffs on steel, for example, at first they were only talking about China, and he was talking about the subsidies that China injects into the steel industry, and then all of a sudden we were also covered by tariffs, and these tariffs are still in place today, unfortunately. But then he wanted to put down a marker, make a statement on this. But in spite of all adversity, we were NATO members able to pursue NATO in a sensible way. And I would hope and wish that this happens also in the next 4 years to come.
I remember very distinctly when Donald Trump was first elected, you were the only one to actually welcome his election conditionally. In other words, based on the respect and the adherence to mutual values, democracy, freedom, diversity, rule of law, human rights, etc. And I just, wonder whether you thought he did act in that way. And especially because you said he was clearly fascinated by the Russian president. In the years that followed, I received the distinct impression that he was captivated by politicians with autocratic and dictatorial traits. How did that manifest itself to you?
Die Art und Weise, wie eben über Putin sprach. Well, in the way that he spoke about Putin, the way that he spoke about the North Korean president, obviously apart from critical remarks he made, there was always a kind of fascination at the sheer power of what these people could do. So my impression always was that he dreamt of actually overriding maybe all those parliamentary bodies that he felt were in a way an encumbrance upon him, and that he wanted to decide matters on his own. And in a democracy, well, you cannot reconcile that with democratic values.
Can I ask you, it just popped into my head, his former chief of staff, John Kelly, who was a Marine general, he actually said that Donald Trump had expressed interest, approval of Nazi generals. Does that surprise you, that he would say something like that?
Ehrlich gesagt, das habe ich gar nicht.
Honestly speaking, I never heard this, and I wouldn't want to make any comment on this. I said that he was fascinated, not too much co-determination, as it were, or too many other people having a say. He wanted to be the person who makes the judgment and the call. But I think once you approached him without any fear and with a clear-cut strategy, he listened. And I think he smells when people are a little bit afraid of him. And when you're not, then you can enter into good talks with him.
And you were not?
Nein.
No, I was the elected Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. I mean, we're not a negligible country. We have our own interests, our own vested interests, and I was always guided by these national interests. I think the United States of America are such an important power, a superpower. But we in Europe are also important. The United States of America cannot do things on their own completely. We have an alliance. We have NATO together. So this is not just something where we owe something to the Americans, as Donald Trump quite often said, but the United States of America too must have a vested interest, or should have a vested interest. At least that would be my advice, because when we stand together, we're simply stronger. And there are so many in the world who do not want democracy. So strength is important in this, against this background.
You have said that he has a nationalistic tone, and that a lot of his negotiations involve a zero-sum game, that for him to win, the other person had to lose, period, end of story. Is that constructive in diplomacy or trade negotiations?
Es ist nicht meine Überzeugung. Meine Überzeugung.
It's not my conviction. I am convinced that through wise compromises, you can bring about win-win situations. Situations where the whole world benefits and oneself also benefits from that. I am someone who actually greatly respects international organizations, the United Nations, the World Trade Organizations and others. I think they're very, very important. I would like to remind all of us, which has somehow receded into the background, that the biggest challenges are climate change and the loss of biodiversity. A human being gets much more vulnerable due to this, and China, the biggest emitter, we have to have them in on this, because otherwise we will not be able to make progress on climate change. It may be, you may in the short run win, but in the long run, humankind will not be the better for it, will not survive.
She worked with 4 U.S. presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump and Biden. More of this revealing conversation next, when Merkel talks about experiencing Putin's fear tactic. Welcome back to the program. On her U.S. book tour this week, the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was reunited for an onstage conversation with her close ally, former U.S. President Barack Obama. But behind the scenes, as she reveals in her new memoir, her tenure dealing with many other world leaders was filled with challenges. She often found herself navigating high-stakes power games, and in the second part of our conversation earlier this week, she opened up about how Putin uses intimidation as a diplomatic tool, and how the war in Ukraine might end with him and now Trump in charge. Let's talk about the security of Europe and Putin and Ukraine. That's the big issue out there right now. In your book, you write about Trump's negotiation to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. And you essentially say that the way it was done, with no communication with the Afghan government, only with the Taliban, the fate of Afghanistan was sealed. That essentially Afghanistan was given back to the Taliban. So everybody's trying to figure out, what is Trump going to do when he says, I can end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours or whatever. What do you think, knowing what you know about this particular individual, and knowing what you know about Putin, how do you think, under these two presidents, that war is going to be ended?
Ich sag mal, dieser Krieg ist ein solches Leid.
This war is such an incredible suffering for the Ukrainian population, and President Zelensky proved to be so courageous when on the day of the aggression happened, didn't leave the country, didn't flee, but stayed in the country and is fighting ever since for a sovereign Ukraine. I don't want to speculate. I don't want to say I can compare this with Afghanistan. I can only say the result of Afghanistan was a disaster, because once you have an elected government, such as the Afghan government, and not include them into such negotiations, so basically give to those who actually violate human rights every day, and give them the power of attorney, so to speak, then later on they have all the possibilities at their disposal to set the conditions. There was no internal peace process in Afghanistan due to this, and President Biden actually accepted that and that result of the negotiations, and we saw that this didn't mean anything good for the Afghan people, even until today. But in Ukraine, well, it will depend on how Europe will sort of, and this is sort of due to my successor, how Europe will position itself. I can't say anything on this now.
Even in negotiations, the Ukrainian politicians, whether it's President Zelensky or others, say, well, how can we negotiate with a liar? He says one thing and does another thing. In your book, you write point blank that Putin told you a brazen lie when you confronted him about Russian troops inside Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014. And he also at one point told you, look at what's happening in Ukraine. This is the 2004 revolution, the Orange Revolution. I will never allow that to happen. How can anybody negotiate with somebody who you yourself, who knew Putin pretty well, calls a brazen liar?
Ja, also ich hatte diesen Punkt am Anfang meiner...
Well, at the beginning of my work as Federal Chancellor, that was not what he did. He did not say these brazen lies. But later on Crimea, he did admit that he had lied. And there was a turning point in our relationship, quite clearly, that I had to be extremely cautious in my approach towards him. So you cannot only trust in an agreement with him, that's absolutely correct. So we have to give to Ukraine, in which form whatsoever, security guarantees, very clear and absolutely reliable guarantees, as we gave them when they said we're going to dispense with our nuclear power at the time. But Ukraine cannot be left without any security guarantee in what maybe we think is a peace. In my book, I write quite clearly that apart from the military support for Ukraine, it is very important to also think now of how a diplomatic solution can look like after the end of the war.
I'm struck in your book, you as the first female Chancellor of Germany, you seem to have been heavily challenged by two macho men. I mean, Donald Trump spent his first campaign, as you write, attacking you. And you were surprised, you say, that he would spend his presidential campaign attacking a German chancellor. Putin kept trying to test you as well. And there's the famous story about the dog, right? And now he's saying that he never knew that you were afraid of the dog when he brought the dog into the meeting the second time that he had that meeting. So he said, please, Angela, please know that I didn't do this to frighten you. I'm paraphrasing him. But you thought he knew exactly what he was doing.
Also da muss ich die Lektüre meines Buches einfach nochmal empfehlen.
Well, look into that particular chapter in my book. When I made my first visit, my foreign political advisor, Christoph Heusgen, at the time said to his interlocutor, Prochotko, his counterpart, that I had been bitten by a dog, so it would be very kind not to have a dog present. I didn't like them all that much. And then he gave to me a stuffed animal, a dog, and said, this one is not going to bite you. So maybe he's forgotten it. But if you read this whole story, then it's not very probable that he didn't know anything about it. I'm writing in my memoir how the situation actually was. In Sochi, I adopted a brave face and said, well, never, as the British royal family says, never explain, never complain. I survived. The dog didn't bite me. So let's leave it at that. But I mean, there's no other explanation for it. It's a small attempt to test the waters, you know, how resilient a person is, how strong. It's power play, basically.
Coming up next, more global crisis as rebel forces advance in Syria's 13-year-long civil war. The staggering human toll of this conflict from up close. We go back to my archive and meet those caught in the middle after the break.